So let's have a lesson on the Sarabande from Suite BWV 996 by Bach. And you can follow the lesson for free, of course, but I do have a sheet music edition of the entire suite, so you can check that out. There's a link for that underneath the video. So a couple of things to talk about here. We'll talk about the general pulse of this particular Sarabande, and then we'll also talk about a couple of the rhythmic elements of the work, and also about how I wrote my addition and in relationship to those rhythms. And then we'll just talk a little bit about the ornamentation and chord forms and things like that. So one thing I'll say about this dance movement is that earlier on the Sarabande was quite fast and elaborate, but by the time of the late Baroque, it's become quite slow and kind of like a processional dance, a grave, and kind of like ceremonious in nature. So fairly slow and flowing. Occasionally you'll get accents in different places besides the first beat. So in with Bach's music, you don't have to think about it too much because quite often, like the second beat, for example, will be emphasized either through the chord that he uses, through harmonic tension or harmonic rhythm, or he'll throw an ornament onto that second beat, and that'll break up the rhythm quite a bit. There's other rhythmic devices that Bach uses, like hemiolas and things like that, which break up the pulse into different ways. But nevertheless, for the most part, in this movement, you don't have to think about it too much. It's pretty obvious he'll throw a larger chord onto the second beat or an ornament, and so just don't be afraid of emphasizing it when you think that it should come out a little bit. The pulse is in 3/2, so that's 3 half notes per bar. That's a pretty big beat when you start looking at some of the rhythms in the piece, but just make sure that you're feeling it in a very calm and gentle way and just swaying through it. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. So there's quite a bit of figuration within the beat sometimes, and that's probably the tricky thing about this work. Just kind of like the courant that we did before. The beat is relatively slow, but the figuration can be quite fast. And in this particular movement, we want the beat to feel as relaxed as possible, despite the quite active figuration in the work. And that's a real challenge because things get wiry and they get difficult, but keeping that gentle pulse will be an important factor. So it just requires a lot of practice and trying to make those lines as fluid as possible, right? And certainly it's not an easy work, so some of the figurations are quite difficult. I find it particularly difficult to grab some of these chords because the texture is so kind of pristine and nice, and yet you have to be getting quite a bit of things on the guitar, on the instrument, which can disrupt the flow. So that's what I find particularly difficult about this work. So we've talked a little bit about that. Now in the second half, there's a couple of rhythms. There's some quintuplets and beyond, and so, but I haven't written those above the music because sometimes when you write that on early music, it just doesn't seem quite natural. It seems like a modern score if you start writing the quintuplets or sextuplets or etc. throughout the entire work. It just looks strange, and in Bach's original score or the copyist version, there are no markings for like quintuplets. It's just like a group of notes that are beamed together, and you have to fit them into the beat. Almost all of them start on the and of 3 though, or the and of one of the beats. So let's go through and just talk about those a little bit. So in the second half, pretty straightforward. Here, so bar 10, 1, 2, and 3, and so that quintuplet there, 3 and 1. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, and I don't always fit them exactly metrically into the and of 3, for example. Sometimes I'll elongate them just slightly to make it sound natural. If you go super metronomic with it, it can sound a little bit tight sounding, a little bit tighter than maybe you want it to, or a little too strict. But I would recommend that you practice the whole piece with the metronome and play it metrically, just so that you learn the rhythms correctly. So if you're popping on a metronome, you could put the metronome to the quarter note and be thinking like 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 1. Just to make sure that you do understand the rhythms and you can play them absolutely properly, but then you can relax it a little bit when you do your final interpretation, right? But it's bad if you don't know or you can't play the actual rhythms. it doesn't do much for your confidence or for your stabilization of the beat. Just break it into very small chunks. When you're reading bar 13, 2 and 3 and then 1 and 2 and that's a pretty tough one for me to count out loud. I do definitely start that figure earlier than the and of 2. I pretty much start it right after the second beat. It's just so much to fit into a little half beat. It's a bit much, so I elongate it slightly. But again, practice it very slowly with the metronome, like slower than you would even perform it. Making sure that you can play it in time, get rid of the trill within that figuration, and make sure you can do it in time. That way, when you actually piece it together, you have a good conception of what that rhythm really is. That B doesn't count, actually. It's a pretty straightforward line in the end, but once you throw that trill in there, and then another trill in there, it's a lot of figuration to do all in half a beat, right? Lots to go over in the piece, but you just want to take it very slow. Use a metronome for quite a long time until you feel like you have a handle on the rhythms when you're playing it slowly, and then your final interpretation will be just a little bit more flowing, right? The only other thing I'll say is that I've made a number of compromises in this piece in regards to fingering versus note values. And I think in Bach you have to make some sacrifices somewhere because it doesn't all fit on the instrument properly. The original score, for example, does like some really long held notes over the entire bars despite all the figuration that you have, which would only be possible on a keyboard. It's not possible on guitar, so there just needs to be some leeway. Also, on a few places, I'll replace a fingering despite a sustaining note just because the note has probably died off by then if it's a really long value. And you have to meet somewhere in between practicality and musicality, so I hope that all of the musicality sounds really, really refined here. But nevertheless, there'll be a couple of sacrifices for fingering. I was kind of hoping that the Sarabande would be quite a bit easier than all the other movements. It's tough playing these for my weekly lessons, but the Sarabande is, don't underestimate it. It's a little bit more difficult than it at first appears. You know, you can kind of sight read through it and it goes kind of all right. But once you start zeroing in on it a little bit more and thinking about the pulse and the rhythm very strictly, it can be quite difficult. So take a lot of time and work your way through it.